The laughter came first. Not loud, not cruel in the way movies make it cruel. Just a thin, confident chuckle that floated across the hangar like it belonged there, like it had permission. Fix this engine. Major General Eleanor Vance said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the heat, and I'll marry you. A few officers laughed. A contractor smirked. Someone behind a clipboard shook their head like this was the kind of joke you told to pass time while real people worked. Malachi Jones didn't laugh. He stood there with a rag in his left hand and jet fuel on his knuckles, 25 years old, spine straight, eyes down. The kind of posture you learned when you figured out early that confidence on the wrong body could be taken as disrespect. The X-88 Ghost Rider sat behind them, matte black and silent, its nose angled slightly downward, like it was listening to all of it. $50 million of experimental engineering, Pentagon brass walking the floor, a Secretary of Defense due to arrive before sundown, and the engine perfect on paper refused to turn over. General Vance turned slightly enough to make sure everyone saw who the joke was aimed at. You, she said again, pointing. What's your name, son? Jones, ma'am. Airman Basic. Jones, she repeated, tasting it. You're assigned to janitorial detail in this hangar, correct? Yes, ma'am. So explain to me, she said, folding her arms, why you've been hovering around my aircraft all morning. Malachi swallowed. He could feel eyes on him now. Engineers from Lockheed, a pair of MIT consultants flown in overnight, career officers who had already decided what kind of future a kid like him was allowed to imagine. I wasn't hovering, ma'am, he said carefully. I was listening. That did it. The chuckles grew. Someone whispered, listening, like it was a foreign language. General Vance smiled thin and sharp, listening to what the floor Malachi didn't answer right away. He knew this moment. He had lived versions of it his whole life. The moment where explaining yourself only made things worse, where words sounded like excuses before they ever became sentences. But she was still looking at him, waiting. Yes, ma'am, he said. The floor, the vibration patterns, the silence that followed wasn't kind. It was the kind that judged. Vance turned to the group, spreading her hands. This, she said, is why we don't let enthusiasm outrun training. Then she looked back at him. You have 5 seconds to get back to your assigned duties before I make a phone call that follows you for the rest of your enlistment. Malachi nodded. Yes, ma'am. He turned to leave. That should have been the end of it. But as he took his first step away, the engine behind them gave a low, hollow click. Not a start. Not even close. Just a sound. Small. Almost embarrassed. Malachi stopped. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He just stood there, head tilted slightly, like someone catching a faint note in a noisy room. General Vance noticed. You have something else to add. Airman, she said. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep walking, to disappear back into the grease pit, where mistakes were quiet and expectations were low. But the sound echoed again in his head. The rhythm was wrong. Yes, ma'am, he said, turning slowly. With respect, she raised an eyebrow. You're already out of respect. The engine isn't failing, he said. It's hesitating. That got her attention, not belief, but irritation sharp enough to focus. Explain, she said. Malachi chose his words like tools. All the diagnostics say it's fine because they're measuring what the engine is supposed to do, not what it's actually doing under stress. One of the contractors scoffed. "We've run full simulations." "I know," Malachi said. "I read them." That earned him a few looks. "You read classified engine diagnostics?" Vance asked. "Yes, ma'am." When they were left open on the terminal. A pause. "Not good." But it was already out, and she said, "And the vibration pattern in the hangar floor changes when the fuel cycle reaches phase 3. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to tell you something's fighting itself." Someone laughed again, nervous this time. General Vance stepped closer. She was shorter than he expected, still terrifying. "Let me get this straight," she said quietly. "You're telling me that a room full of decorated engineers missed something you caught with your boots on the concrete?" "Yes, ma'am." Why Malachi thought of Detroit winters, of his grandfather's hands wrapped in rags, holding metal like it could feel fear. "Because machines talk," he said. "Most people don't listen long enough." That did it. Vance laughed again, louder this time. "Unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "Then clearly for everyone, fix this engine, and I'll marry you." The hangar broke. Laughter bounced off steel and glass. Someone actually clapped. Malachi felt the heat rise in his face, but he didn't move. He looked at the engine. Not the cameras, not the general, not the men who had already written him off. Just the engine. "I don't want to marry you, ma'am," he said. The laughter stuttered. "I want 5 minutes," he continued, "and permission not to be interrupted." Silence. General Vance stared at him like he'd just spoken another language. "You're asking me," she said slowly, "to let an uncredentialed enlisted airman touch a $50 million prototype during a Pentagon inspection?" "Yes, ma'am." "And if you're wrong," Malachi met her eyes, "then I'll take whatever punishment you decide." A long beat. Somewhere in the hangar, a phone camera clicked on. Vance exhaled through her nose. "This is a circus," she said. Then sharply, 2 minutes. You don't open anything. You don't touch anything critical. And the second I say stop, you stop." "Yes, ma'am." As he stepped toward the Ghost Rider, the noise faded. The jokes, the whispers, the certainty that he didn't belong. All he could hear was the engine, waiting. Detroit did not teach Malachi Jones how to dream. It taught him how to listen. The city spoke in winter, in the groan of frozen engines that refused to turn over, in the rattle of loose exhaust pipes echoing down empty streets before dawn, in the way old machines coughed before they failed, giving you one last chance if you were paying attention. Malachi learned that lesson from his grandfather, Elijah Wrench Jones, long before he understood what an aircraft engine was. Elijah lived in a narrow brick house on the east side, the kind with a sagging porch and a garage that smelled permanently of oil and iron. Inside that garage were no trophies, no framed photos, no plaques, just tools. Hundreds of them, some polished, some cracked, none thrown away. Metal remembers, Elijah used to say, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "You treat it like it don't, it'll embarrass you when it matters." Elijah Jones had fixed P-51 Mustangs during the war, not as a pilot, as something less celebrated and more essential. A man who listened to engines before other men trusted them with their lives. He never talked much about the Tuskegee Airmen, not the way documentaries did. No speeches, no nostalgia. When Malachi once asked him why, Elijah tightened a bolt and said, "Because history likes clean stories. We lived dirty ones." The lessons came instead through work. On a night, Malachi never forgot the temperature dropped below zero. Power lines snapped across the neighborhood. Sirens screamed somewhere far off, then stopped too suddenly. A neighbor pounded on the door, breath clouding the air. "Ambulance won't start," she said. "My husband, he ain't breathing right." Elijah didn't grab his coat, didn't ask questions. He grabbed a roll of copper wire and a lighter. They found the ambulance stalled in the street hood, up engine, silent and cold. The driver kept apologizing, voice shaking. "Computer says it's fine," he kept saying. "Everything reads fine." Elijah ignored the screen. He leaned in close, one ear, near the engine block, eyes closed. Malachi remembered how strange that looked, this old black man in the dark, listening like the machine might confess something if asked the right way. "There," Elijah said softly. Malachi heard nothing. Just wind. Just cold. But Elijah moved with certainty. He stripped insulation from the copper wire, bridged a connection the manual would never suggest, and heated it just enough with the lighter to wake the metal. "Crank it," he said. The engine coughed, then caught. Inside the ambulance, a man took a full breath for the first time in minutes. Nobody clapped. Nobody wrote it down. By morning, the ambulance was gone, and Elijah was back in his garage cleaning his tools. That night planted something in Malachi. Not pride, responsibility. "You hear things other folks don't," Elijah told him later. "That ain't a gift. That's a burden. Means you don't get to ignore problems just because they're inconvenient." As Malachi grew older, he learned the cost of that burden. In school, teachers told him he was smart but unfocused, too quiet, asked too many strange questions. Why did the machine sound different after the test, even when it passed? Why did it vibrate wrong when the numbers said it shouldn't? When he tried to explain, people smiled politely, then moved on. Even Elijah tried to warn him. This country, his grandfather said one evening, sitting on the stoop, loves innovation right up until it comes from the wrong mouth. Malachi joined the Air Force anyway, not because he believed the system was fair, but because machines didn't lie. They either worked or they didn't. And if you listened long enough, they told you why. By the time he was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, he already understood something most people never learned. Credentials impressed people. Outcomes saved lives. Still, the base reminded him daily where he stood. He watched engineers arrive with perfect resumes and leave with perfect excuses. He scrubbed floors beneath aircraft worth more than his entire neighborhood back home. He logged vibrations in a small notebook no one had asked him to keep, marking patterns no sensor flagged. Sometimes he wondered if Elijah had felt this too, being essential and invisible at the same time. The night before the Pentagon inspection, Malachi stayed late. Not because he was told to, because the hangar felt wrong. The concrete hummed under his boots in a way it hadn't before. Subtle, uneven, like a heartbeat skipping just often enough to be dangerous. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, he was back in Detroit, back in the garage, back beside a man the country never properly thanked. Elijah had once shown him a faded photograph. Young men in flight jackets, smiling despite everything stacked against them. "They let us fix their planes," Elijah said. "Didn't always let us fly them. But every time one came back safe, we knew what Malachi asked." "That excellence don't need permission," Elijah replied. "But it does need witnesses." Standing alone in the hangar, Malachi understood. that the Ghost Rider wasn't just a machine. It was a test of whether anyone in the room was still listening. He placed his palm against the fuselage, felt the vibration travel through bone and muscle, just like the frozen ambulance years ago. The engine wasn't broken. It was warning them. And if history had taught him anything, it was this: when warnings from people like him were ignored, the cost was always paid later by someone who never got a say. Malachi straightened, picked up his rag, and wrote one more note in his log. Not because anyone had asked, but because Elijah Jones had taught him that silence when you know better is its own kind of failure. By 2:00 a.m., the hangar no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a siege. The lights were dimmed to half power, casting long shadows across the concrete. Empty coffee cups lined a folding table where men with credentials longer than Malachi Jones's entire service record stared at screens that refused to change their minds. Again, someone muttered. The engine diagnostics scrolled. Green. All green. Perfect. The Ghost Rider remained silent. A Lockheed engineer rubbed his eyes. We've rerun the fuel mapping 3 times. There's nothing there. Then why won't it start? Another snapped. No one answered. Outside the hangar, the base clock ticked closer to morning. At 0700, the Secretary of Defense would arrive. At 07:15, the program would either fly or be frozen audited and likely buried. Hundreds of jobs, billions in funding, years of careers balanced on an engine that refused to cooperate. Malachi stood near the perimeter as instructed, hands clean now. Rag folded in his back pocket, invisible again, but he could feel it. The vibration under his boots wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was wrong in a way numbers didn't know how to describe. Like a voice forced into a whisper. One of the engineers slammed his laptop shut. We're chasing ghosts. Malachi flinched. Across the hangar, base security stepped in uniforms, crisp, posture stiff. The lead officer scanned the room. General Vance wants non-essential personnel cleared from the floor. The message was clear. Airman Jones, the officer said, eyes settling on him. That means you. Malachi nodded. He started toward the exit. Then the engine coughed. Not enough to start, just enough to speak. Malachi stopped. The sound cut through the room like a held breath. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the aircraft. Malachi didn't think. He listened. The pitch was wrong. The timing off by a fraction most people would never notice. But once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. He turned back. Sir, he said quietly to the nearest engineer, may I ask something? The man looked at his rank, then away. Not now. It's about the fuel injection timing, Malachi said. It's firing when the governor says it should not, when the engine needs it to. That earned a laugh. Tired. Sharp. The digital governor controls everything the engineer said. You can't outthink it with intuition. Malachi nodded. I'm not trying to outthink it. I'm trying to bypass it. Just long enough to hear the engine breathe. Security stepped closer. Airman, the officer warned. Before Malachi could answer, a voice cut through the tension. Hold up. Chief Master Sergeant Harold Green stepped forward. His hair was gray. His posture was calm, in a way that came from having nothing left to prove. He looked at Malachi, really looked at him. Jones, he said, you Elijah's grandson. Malachi froze. Yes, Chief. Green nodded once. I knew your grandfather. The room shifted, subtly, like a door cracking open. He listened better than anyone I ever saw, Green said. Saved my life more than once. The Lockheed engineer scoffed. With respect, Chief, this isn't nostalgia hour. Green didn't look at him. This is a moment where we decide whether rank matters more than results. He turned to security. Give us 10 minutes. That's not your call, the officer said. Green finally looked at him. It is, if you want this base to still matter tomorrow. A long beat. Then security stepped back. Malachi felt his pulse in his throat. Green leaned in close. You sure, he asked softly. Malachi thought of Detroit, of frozen steel, of engines that warned you before they failed if you were humble enough to listen. No, Chief, he said, but I'm closer than the computer. Green nodded. That'll do. They cleared a small space near the engine. Malachi moved with careful purpose. No bravado. No rush. He pulled a small tuning fork from his pocket. Bright blue. A children's science toy bought years ago at a dollar store. He struck it lightly against the metal frame. The vibration rang clean and clear. He pressed a stethoscope, old borrowed scuffed, against the casing. The room watched. What is he doing? Someone whispered. Listening, Green said. Malachi closed his eyes. There it was. The hesitation. A fractional delay between fuel and ignition. Not enough to trip alarms. Enough to build heat where it didn't belong. He remembered Elijah's voice. If you don't know, don't touch the heart. Malachi hesitated. If he was wrong, he wouldn't just fail. He would confirm every assumption made about him. About who was allowed near critical systems. About who paid the price for confidence. He adjusted his stance. Took a breath. Then he acted. 3 moves. No more. He adjusted the fuel injection timing, manually just enough to shift the rhythm. He engaged a temporary bypass on the digital governor, not to override it, but to let it listen too. Then he reset the cycle. Hands steady. Movements precise. Stop, someone shouted. Security stepped forward again. Green moved between them. Nobody touches him. Malachi stepped back. Crank it, he said. The starter engaged. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the engine caught. Not with a roar. Not with violence. With a low, even purr. The sound rolled across the hangar, smooth and controlled. Older mechanics felt it in their chests. Some of them swallowed hard. The Lockheed engineer stared at his screen. That's not possible. Malachi listened. The vibration had changed, smoothed out. But something else was there now. A warning buried beneath success. Shut it down, he said suddenly. What? Someone barked. Now. Green didn't ask questions. Kill it. The engine powered down. The silence afterward was heavy. Malachi turned to the engineers. The problem isn't failure, he said. It's survival. They stared at him. The cooling vents, he continued. They're designed for ideal airflow. In combat conditions, heat builds where the sensors don't measure. The engine hesitates because it's protecting itself. If it flew like this, the pilot wouldn't get a warning. He'd just lose power. No one spoke. One of the MIT consultants slowly sat down. Malachi exhaled. He hadn't just fixed the engine. He had heard what it was trying to say before it was too late. Dawn at Edwards didn't arrive gently. It came hard and bright, spilling over the hangar doors and turning the desert sky into a sheet of pale fire. Inside, nobody moved like it was morning. Men who had been certain 12 hours ago stood quiet now, as if the sound of the Ghost Rider had rewired something in them. The aircraft sat with its nose slightly lifted, engine idling in a steady, controlled rhythm that felt almost unreal after the long night of failure. Not a scream, not a growl, a clean purr, precise enough to make older mechanics blink fast and look away. Chief Master Sergeant Harold Green watched the gauges with his arms folded, jaw set, as if daring reality to argue with him. Malachi Jones stood a few feet back, hands at his sides, eyes not on the people, but on the machine. He'd shut it down once then, brought it back up after the adjustments were confirmed. He kept listening even now, even when it sounded perfect. Because perfect was sometimes the most dangerous lie a system could tell. The hangar doors clanged. Boot steps. Crisp. Measured. Major General Eleanor Vance walked in like she owned the air itself. Her uniform looked untouched by the night. Her hair was tight. Her face composed, her eyes already scanning for excuses and failures the way some people scanned for exits. She stopped when she heard the engine. She didn't show surprise at first. She couldn't afford to. But her eyes shifted quick and sharp to the Ghost Rider's intake and the steady tremble of the exhaust. A contractor started to speak, then thought better of it. Vance walked closer until she was within a few feet of the aircraft. The sound filled the space behind her, steady, disciplined. It didn't ask for applause. It didn't beg for forgiveness. She turned slowly, gaze sweeping the room, landing on faces that wouldn't meet her eyes. "Status," she said. No one answered right away. The Lockheed engineer finally cleared his throat. "Engine start achieved, ma'am. Stable idle. All systems reading achieved," by whom Vance cut in. The engineer hesitated, looked toward Malachi, looked away again, as if saying his name out loud would cost him something. Green stepped forward. "Airman Basic Malachi Jones," he said. The room went still. Vance's expression didn't change, but something tightened in her jaw. She looked at Malachi like he was a math problem that shouldn't exist. "That's impossible," she said, more to the room than to him. Malachi didn't flinch. "No, ma'am." Her eyes narrowed. "Explain." He could have enjoyed this moment. Plenty of people would have. It was the kind of reversal that begged for a little satisfaction. Malachi didn't give it to them. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm. The engine wasn't broken. It was protecting itself. The digital governor and the diagnostics kept calling it perfect because they weren't measuring the right stress point. Vance looked to the engineers, expecting someone to correct him. Nobody did. The cooling vents. Malachi continued, "Create a heat pocket under sustained load. It doesn't show up in the current sensor array. The engine hesitates because it's anticipating thermal runaway." One of the MIT consultants, pale from no sleep, nodded reluctantly. "He's right," he said. "We modeled ideal airflow. We didn't model hostile conditions." Vance stared at him. "And you missed that?" The consultant swallowed. "We didn't hear it." Vance turned back to Malachi. "You heard it," she said. "Yes, ma'am." How she pressed. Malachi paused, then answered with the simplest truth he had. "Because I wasn't trying to prove the computer right. I was trying to understand why the engine was scared." That word hit the room like a gust of cold. Scared. Machines weren't supposed to be scared. Jets weren't supposed to hesitate. Programs weren't supposed to have flaws at this level, not with this much money and this many eyes. Vance stepped closer. "Watch your language, airmen," she said, though it sounded less like a threat and more like she needed something to grab onto. Malachi nodded. Yes, ma'am. The point is the same. If this aircraft flew as designed under combat stress, it could lose power without warning. That's not a maintenance issue. That's a design flaw. Silence. The older mechanics in the back shifted their weight. One of them mouthed Jesus and shook his head. Vance's gaze flicked to the aircraft again. The Ghost Rider sat there calm and deadly, like a secret that had almost stayed buried. For the first time since she entered, her posture softened not in weakness, but in recalibration. Like a compass suddenly finding true north. She looked at the team. Who signed off on the vent design she demanded? The Lockheed engineer swallowed. It went through multiple review boards, ma'am. That's not an answer, she snapped. The engineer glanced toward a binder on the table, then toward Vance herself, as if the truth was about to betray the room. Vance noticed. Her eyes moved to the binder, then to the signature page. Her signature. A second passed, then another. The engine purred in the background, steady as a heartbeat. Vance didn't blink. But the color drained slightly from her face. Not embarrassment, not yet. Something heavier. Because it wasn't about being wrong in front of the Pentagon. It was about the fact that if this flaw had made it into the air, someone with a helmet and a call sign would have trusted her signature with their life. And she would have buried them with paperwork and patriotism. She turned to Malachi again. Shut it down, she said. Green gestured. The engine powered off. The hangar fell into a silence so complete it felt staged. Vance stepped closer to Malachi until she was within arm's reach. Her voice lowered, controlled. But there was something raw under it now. You understand what you're claiming, she said. If you're wrong, you've interfered with a federal inspection. You've manipulated a prototype. You've created a narrative that will follow this program and this base for years. Yes, ma'am, Malachi said. And if I'm right, we have a duty to fix it before anyone straps in. Vance held his gaze. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who had already made peace with the cost of telling the truth. That unsettled her more than any disrespect could have. Behind her, a contractor shifted and muttered, "This kid's out of line." Green's voice cut through. "No," he said. "He's in the line. The one that keeps pilots alive." Vance didn't turn to the contractor. She kept her eyes on Malachi. Then quietly, she said, "You were on janitorial detail." "Yes, ma'am." "You were scrubbing floors?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you were logging vibration patterns in the concrete, like some kind of mechanic's folklore." Malachi's expression didn't change. "Yes, ma'am." Vance exhaled slowly, like letting go of something she'd been gripping for years. She looked around the hangar at the men who had laughed, the men who had watched, the men who had stayed silent because silence was safer than challenging a general. And for the first time, her voice carried something other than authority. It carried recognition. "I made a mistake," she said. The room stiffened. People weren't used to hearing that sentence from someone like her. "I believed," she continued, "that discipline was the same as superiority. That rank meant clarity. That authority meant I couldn't be wrong." Her eyes moved back to Malachi. "And I used a joke to remind you where you belonged." The words hung in the air. Malachi didn't speak. Vance's jaw tightened again, not in anger now, but in shame she was trying to keep from showing. "That ends today," she said. She turned sharply to the engineers. "I want an immediate redesign review on those vents. No shortcuts. No ego. We do not fly a machine that carries a hidden death sentence." Then she looked back at Malachi, her voice quieter. "And Airman Jones," she said, "you're not going back to the grease pit." Malachi's throat tightened slightly. He kept his face steady, but Green saw it. The small flicker of feeling a person tries not to let show when they've learned the world punishes it. Vance held her stare on him for a beat longer. Then, with a controlled steadiness that sounded like someone choosing to become a different kind of leader, she said, "You saved this program. You may have saved a pilot I'll never meet." She paused. "And I need you to understand something." Malachi waited. Her voice dropped almost private. "That joke I made, it wasn't funny. It was cruelty dressed up as confidence." Malachi nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The hangar remained silent, not because anyone was afraid to speak, because the truth had finally taken the floor. The bet died quietly, not with laughter, not with apology. It simply stopped existing, like a bad habit exposed to daylight. A week after the inspection, the Ghost Rider sat grounded by design, not failure. Red tags hung from access panels. Engineers moved slower now. They talked less. They listened more. Meetings that used to start with credentials started with questions. Malachi Jones noticed the difference right away. People looked at him when he spoke. Not with curiosity, not with suspicion, with expectation. Major General Eleanor Vance stood at the front of the briefing room, hands resting on the table, eyes steady. The room was full, officers, contractors, senior enlisted civilians whose opinions used to end conversations before they began. "This is not a disciplinary meeting," she said. "This is a correction." She let that land. The X-88 program did not fail because of a lack of intelligence, Vance continued. It failed because we confused hierarchy with insight. No one interrupted her. She turned, slightly gesturing toward Malachi, who sat near the wall, back straight, hands folded the way he'd learned long before anyone ever asked his opinion. Airman Jones identified a design flaw that our systems, our models, and our assumptions missed, she said, not because he broke protocol, but because he understood the craft. Someone shifted in their seat. "This organization has a habit," Vance went on, "of treating experience as something you earn only through rank. That habit almost got someone killed." She paused, then said the words no one expected. "That stops now." The changes came fast after that, not symbolic, structural. A new review protocol required at least one enlisted maintainer in every critical design meeting, not as an observer, as a voting voice. Vibration logs, once dismissed as anecdotal, were formalized into diagnostic supplements, floor data, sound data, human data. When one engineer complained that it slowed innovation, Vance answered without hesitation. "Good," she said. "Fast mistakes are still mistakes." Malachi was called into her office 2 days later. Not summoned, invited. She didn't sit behind the desk. She stood near the window, looking out at the runway where jets cut lines through heat and air. "You don't owe me politeness," she said without turning around. "But you do owe me honesty." "Yes, ma'am," Malachi replied. She turned. "I made a spectacle of you." "Yes, ma'am." "I won't justify it," she said. "I won't explain it away. I need to know what you want." The question surprised him. He had imagined anger, vindication, even fear. He hadn't imagined being asked, "I don't want your hand." he said. Or your name. She nodded once. I assumed. I want a seat at the table. He continued. Not just for me, for everyone you've ever told to stay in their lane when their lane was the only one close enough to the problem. Vance studied him. And if that seat costs you, she asked. Malachi didn't hesitate. Then it was never a real seat. That was when she smiled. Not sharply, not defensively, honestly. The Elijah Jones Scholarship was announced quietly. No press release, no speeches. A full ride. Mechanical engineering, MIT. The paperwork described it as an investment in technical excellence. Vance described it differently when she handed Malachi the folder. This is me admitting, she said, that your grandfather's generation fixed the future without being invited into it. Malachi ran his thumb over the name on the cover, Elijah Jones. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not pride. Something heavier. Something earned. I'll go, he said. But I'm coming back. I know, Vance replied. Some people were unhappy. A senior contractor filed a complaint about chain of command erosion. An anonymous memo circulated about lowering standards. Someone wrote that the Air Force was romanticizing Greece. Chief Master Sergeant Green taped that one to the break room fridge. Funny thing about Greece, he said to anyone who asked. Keeps machines alive. Malachi didn't argue with critics. He didn't need to. He spent his remaining weeks at Edwards doing something no one had assigned him to do. He taught, not classes, conversations. He showed younger airmen how to feel vibration through their boots, how to tap a casing and hear the difference between stress and noise, how to trust data without surrendering judgment. One afternoon, a 17-year-old trainee lingered after a shift. Airman Jones, the kid said, how do you know when to speak up? Malachi thought about Detroit, about frozen engines, about laughter in a hangar. You don't, he said. You decide when not speaking would be worse. The day he left for MIT, the hangar was loud with work. No ceremony, no applause. Vance met him near the door. They'll resist this, she said. Change always threatens someone. I know, Malachi replied. She hesitated, then extended her hand. He shook it. For what it's worth, she said, you changed how I lead. Malachi nodded. For what it's worth, ma'am, you listen. That mattered. Years later, the changes at Edwards would be studied, replicated, quietly credited to policy reform and leadership evolution. But the people who were there remembered it differently. They remembered a kid with dirty hands who refused to accept that silence was professionalism. They remembered a general who chose accountability over comfort. They remembered an engine that purred because someone finally heard what it was trying to say. On his last walk through the hangar, Malachi paused near the concrete floor. He closed his eyes. The vibration was steady now, honest. He smiled just a little. Then he kept walking, carrying a legacy forward, not as a story about humiliation, but as proof that when craft is respected, the future runs cleaner, and quieter, and safer. Some stories end with applause. This one ends with a quieter sound, the steady hum of something fixed the right way. Malachi Jones did not change the system by shouting at it. He didn't win by embarrassing those who mocked him. He didn't rise by tearing anyone down. He did something far more difficult and far more lasting. He listened when everyone else trusted the noise. At Edwards Air Force Base, a $50 million aircraft exposed a truth we often refuse to confront. The problem was never a lack of intelligence, funding, or technology. The problem was assumption. Assumption about who belongs near the problem. Assumption about whose voice counts. Assumption that rank, title, or polish automatically equals wisdom. Malachi entered that hangar as a janitor in uniform. He left it as a catalyst for change. Not because he demanded respect, but because he carried responsibility. Responsibility to the craft. Responsibility to the pilot who would one day trust that machine with their life. Responsibility to a legacy passed down by a grandfather whose excellence was essential yet unseen. And Major General Eleanor Vance's journey mattered just as much. Her reckoning wasn't about humiliation. It was about courage, the courage to admit that authority does not make us infallible, and that leadership means creating space for truth, even when it comes from unexpected places. She could have protected her ego. Instead, she protected lives. That decision reshaped an entire program. This is what makes the story resonate far beyond a military hangar. Because the real question isn't about jets or rank or engineering. It's this: how many voices do we dismiss every day because they don't look the way we expect competence to look in our workplaces, in our communities, in our families? How often do we ignore the person closest to the problem because they don't sit at the head of the table? The lesson here is not believe in yourself. That's too shallow. The real lesson is this: mastery earns its authority long before it is recognized. And silence, when we know better, is not humility, it's complicity. Applying this to life today means slowing down enough to listen. It means respecting craft over credentials when the moment demands it. It means asking not who's in charge, but who understands this best. And if you are the one who understands, having the courage to speak even when the room isn't built for you. Malachi didn't ask for permission to care deeply. He simply refused to ignore what he heard. That is how real change begins. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink how power and potential show up in the real world, then you're exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to the channel. Support the work. Help us keep telling stories that honor craft dignity and quiet excellence, stories that don't just entertain, but stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because the next story might sound different, but the truth it carries will matter just as much.